the title of my talk is a question. It is whether collective victim beliefs, so how people remember past victimization of their group, contribute to cycles of violence or to peace. And I'm remembering Emile Bruno, who was always interested in this question, although he didn't work on it directly himself. He always was interested in this work, and I remember talking to him about it at my kitchen table, at an airport, at conferences. He invited me to speak about it and always showed interest in some of the concepts I'll be talking about today. So this question about whether collective victimization contributes to violence or peace comes from some of the assumptions in the literature on how collective victimization informs intergroup relations. Because one of the big assumptions in this field of work has been that collective memories of victimization feed into cycles of violence. And this has been shown in several different ways. So for example, that when you remind people of historical in-group victimization, in certain contexts, they are more likely to legitimize violence and unrelated conflicts. This has been studied in the Israeli-Palestinian context, for example. And also one of the most commonly studied collective victim beliefs has been competitive victimhood or siege mentality as well. And both of these tend to predict less forgiveness, less willingness for reconciliation, increased hostility, etc. And so this emphasis in the field on these types of studies may give the impression that collective memories of victimization inevitably contribute to cycles of violence. Another assumption in the field is that in-group victimization is central to group members and to their identities. And again, the field tends to portray it almost in a way as if people are obsessed or preoccupied with the group's victimization. So for example, there are studies or quotes about people, wanting to win the victim status. And again, it's implied in the work on competitive victimhood that people compete over and want to claim their group's victimization, which implies that this is central to group identities and to group members. And of course, this then reinforces or amplifies the first assumption or tendency I presented, that this will then further feed into cycles of violence because of, for example, the desire for revenge when it is a preoccupation of group members. And then a third assumption is kind of linked to this, the idea that people are focused on intergroup attitudes and intergroup relations as a primary concern in the context of collective victimization. And this is rooted, I think, in the origin of work on collective victim beliefs or victimhood in social psychology as rooted in interest on conflict and peace. So this is kind of the domain in which it started, which has then led to a focus on this as the kind of primary outcome of how people think about their group's victimization. I would argue that there are a few different reasons for these assumptions and foci in the field. So one is something of a sampling bias. There are a lot of studies that have been conducted in certain contexts, above all Israeli-Palestinian conflict, also Northern Ireland. And this is, of course, a particular historical, social, political context, including some historical victim groups that now are in a more dominant position and also engaged in present-day conflict. There has also been then, which is common in our field, a generalization bias, kind of lack of attention to this historical and political context, and a tendency to take what we find in one particular context and generalize it to the phenomenon of collective victimhood in general, without paying attention to issues like power differences, historical and political context differences. And then finally, there's also a methodological bias. Social psychology tends to use quantitative studies, where researchers predetermine which contexts are of interest and just study those, limit their studies to the constructs they deem relevant a priori, without considering if there may be other ideas that are perhaps more relevant to participants regarding the topic. So with these points in mind, in the current talk, I will present some counterpoints based on a few different studies that my collaborators and I did with different methodologies in different contexts. And based on these findings, I will argue that, first of all, and most importantly, the outcomes of collective victim beliefs are not inevitably destructive. Instead, it depends on how we construe and make sense of collective victimization. Second of all, not all group members actually perceive their group's victimization as relevant and central to the group. They are certainly not always preoccupied with the group's victimization. And they also do not always think that, for example, intergroup relations or competitive victim beliefs are the primary issue. And then instead, people also, in addition or instead, may focus on issues related to resistance, resilience, solidarity, or rebuilding community in the aftermath of their group's victimization, which feed into more peaceful and just communities. All right, so the first counterpoint, that collective victim beliefs are not always destructive. It depends on how they are construed. Here I will focus on our work on inclusive versus exclusive victim beliefs and show some findings from this paper here cited at the bottom. So just a brief definition of these terms in case you are not familiar with them yet. Exclusive victim beliefs is what has mostly been studied in the literature. It can include the perceived distinctiveness or uniqueness of the group's victimization. So, for example, competitive victimhood is one example of exclusive victim beliefs, the idea that we suffered more than others, but also perceived uniqueness or differences in experiences. And these kinds of victim beliefs tend to predict negative intergroup outcomes, as I mentioned before. In contrast, inclusive victim beliefs are perceived similarities with other groups' experiences of collective victimization. So, for example, the idea that there are other groups that suffered as much as we did, or that others suffered in similar ways. And these beliefs tend to predict pro-social outcomes, which we can explain based on what we know about, for example, the effects of perceived similarity in general on pro-social behavior, or also superordinate categorization on pro-social attitudes and beliefs. And here at the bottom of the slide are a few examples of studies that had been showing these effects initially, but oftentimes just using one measure or the other or a specific context. So in this study, we wanted to look at it combining at the same time looking systematically at both types of measures, and then looking at different contexts, including both ethnic or religious minority groups who experienced genocide in their past, and then national majority groups who have a history of war, occupation, etc. in their group's history. So here are some sample items of the measures. As I just mentioned, you can kind of recognize what we just discussed. These are for different contexts of the studies, just to give you an idea of how they looked. And then here's the model that we tested. So we basically posited, based on theory and initial findings, that inclusive victim beliefs are responsible for kind of the good stuff, so willingness to reconcile with the perpetrator group, but also pro-social attitudes towards other kinds of outgroups, so not the perpetrator group, but generalizing to other victim groups in need in other parts of the world, for example. And then in contrast, that exclusive victim beliefs would predict the bad stuff, so resentment of the perpetrator group, but also hostility towards other victim groups in need, such as Syrian refugees, which Laura just mentioned before as a context. We also further posited that inclusive and exclusive victim beliefs would mediate the effects of more general individual differences that are linked to positive and negative intergroup attitudes, specifically universal orientation and empathy. Here we expected that inclusive victim beliefs would mediate these effects on reconciliation and pro-social attitudes, and then in-group superiority, the perception that your group is better than others, we expected that would be mediated by exclusive victim beliefs. We found, using multi-group SEM and showing measurement equivalence in these different contexts, we found generally support for these predictions, with the exception of the generalization to other outgroups in studies 1A and 1B. The generalization effect only worked for studies 2A and 2B, but generally there was support for this notion that it really depends how people construe and think about the group's victimization, and this will help explain whether we see positive or negative intergroup outcomes. But now what we also noticed in this study was a second issue. So this idea that everyone will naturally care about and be concerned with the group's victimization was not necessarily true for our participants. So in this study, we had also included some open-ended measures asking about the items. And the items in this study also included measures of perceived centrality of in-group victimization. That is an outcome, that is a variable we had controlled for in the analysis to take into account perceived differences in the relevance of these issues. And then after participants completed the items, we asked them to just say a bit more about what they think about these issues, explain their answers, or just tell us what we missed. And then we conducted a qualitative content analysis on the data from approximately 600 participants across these 6 different contexts, or no, more than 6, anyway, many participants. We found several different themes and categories in the analysis, some of which extended on the items, obviously. We also found that some of the answers really rejected the assumptions in these items. And so what I'll focus on here for a moment is the issue of perceived centrality versus defocusing or decentering victimization. So we identified in the answers 4 different sub-themes or sub-codes, which shed light on the different ways in which some participants, not all, but really a large number, it was about 50% or so of the overall sample, that fell into this code of defocusing victimization. And they had kind of several different arguments, 4 different arguments, why they thought that the group shouldn't be as focused on the group's victimization. So the first subcode was simply perceived lack of relevance. Here's a Northern Irish participant saying that he or she was not really interested in these issues, recognizing that it's important, but then saying that I feel that change will not come, and the history on each side just keeps up this burden. Because of that, this participant said they were fed up or bored, that it was tiresome as it's a constant topic and a negative one. So this participant was pushing back against the focus on collective victimization in Northern Irish society and saying, I'm not interested. A second subcode or theme was the idea of moving on. So here a Hungarian participant says, people like to complain in Hungary. In my opinion, we shouldn't mourn over the past things, over suffering. Instead, we should focus on the present and the future, and we should approach the world positively and look for opportunities. We shouldn't forget, but we should make peace with certain past events. Similarly, some participants pointed out that there were harmful consequences in their opinion of, as this participant says, living life always in the perspective of being victimized. It is important not to let such feelings overwhelm the positive aspects of being Jewish. And this relates also to the next and final subcode we had, which was that some participants focused on other things about their identity or culture that they thought their group should focus on more, pointing out that it kind of skews or takes away attention from these other more positive aspects of the group's culture and history. This Armenian American participant says that if people focus on victimization, they miss out on the richness of the Armenian culture and people, and they also miss out on some happiness. So overall, these findings, again, kind of push back against the idea that people are preoccupied with their group's collective victimization, and it also pushes back against the idea that a history of collective victimization will inevitably feed into cycles of violence because of people's preoccupation and construal in a certain way. So then the third counterpoint I want to present is that people are also not always, if they are interested and perceive their group's victimization as still relevant to their group, they do not actually always focus on intergroup relations either. It's not always the primary concern. And this showed up in our studies in 2 different ways. So one, as I mentioned before, people in a few different studies where we asked for their opinion in more qualitative types of data collection, they oftentimes would push back against, for example, the intergroup comparisons of different groups suffering. They oftentimes rejected these ideas as irrelevant or distasteful. I'll give some quotes in a moment and examples. And then in addition, or instead, many participants, when you just ask them kind of freely what they think is important and relevant about their group's victimization, they will often focus on intra-group issues instead of on intergroup dimensions, lessons, etc., of the group's victimization. So just a few examples to illustrate. In this study that I just mentioned before, the content analysis of follow-up questions after the quantitative survey items, looking at inclusive and exclusive victim beliefs, we also found that many people rejected these items and these comparisons. It was, I think, about 10% or so of the sample that thought that these items were offensive or irrelevant. So here, a Jewish participant says, comparative suffering of Jews versus Palestinians does not factor greatly into how I think of these issues or of this conflict. Suffering is not a competitive sport. Or a Hungarian participant who said, it is distasteful to rank the severity of tragedies. Similarly, in a different study, quoted here in the bottom, this was a focus group study where we asked, again, Jewish and Armenian American participants, but also Burundian and Nepali Bhutanese refugees in the US, to basically narrate the history of their group's experiences, but then also take a look at the items that we typically use in these studies and give us some feedback on whether they think they made sense or not. And here again, we had the same theme that some people just told us, you know what, that is the stupidest question. I mean, they're making an analogy here to comparing it with, you know, asking kids, one kid who broke an arm and the other who broke a leg, which one is worse? And this participant says, that's the stupidest question. What are you talking about? Both are bad. And you don't compare horrors. You just don't do that. So overall, this isn't a large proportion of participants, but at least, you know, a healthy part of our participants reject these assumptions, these constructs that we tend to focus on in the field. And then the question is, so what do people focus on instead? What do they think is relevant when thinking about the group's collective victimization? And here I want to just very briefly now at the end show some quickly an excerpt of findings from a current study we are conducting in 5 different contexts that you see here on the screen, including, again, minority group members and national majority group members, all with a history of victimization and some with ongoing oppression and violence against their group. And here we used Q methodology to look at which kinds of collective victim beliefs are actually deemed relevant and what's the variation within each of the samples as well as across groups in terms of what is deemed relevant in regard to groups' victimization. So Q methodology, this was conducted with these collaborators from each context. Q methodology, I won't explain here in detail, but basically it is a method where you take kind of the all possible statements and ideas that you think are relevant or that based on your review of the literature and the discourse in that context could be relevant to people. So in this case, we had 60 different collective victim belief statements. And then you ask people to sort them into this kind of normal distribution based on how close this is to how they think about the issue. So they sort them into the statements they think are relevant statements versus irrelevant statements and neutral statements. And then you do a factor analysis with across participants with each participant's sorting pattern as the unit, not the item, but how people put these statements in relation to each other and which are emphasized and which are not. And then you find certain kinds of clusters within each group, people who sorted these items in a similar way. So we did that with those 5 different samples. And then we also did a second order factor analysis looking across the 5 different contexts we had to see if there are any kinds of similar pattern types that show up. And so again, I can't go into detail here in the interest of time, but what I just want to point out and show is that we found 6 different factors. And among these 6 different factors, there were really only 2 that focused on kind of the intergroup dimension at all, or actually really just 1 here, the second factor that had a stronger emphasis on the intergroup dimension. In all other factors, it was either only the in-group that people focused on in certain ways that I'll mention in a moment, or they also, in some cases, explicitly rejected for example, negative intergroup attitudes. So instead of focusing on comparisons with other groups suffering, if we're similar, different, etc., or that the intergroup hostility towards the perpetrator, things like that, people instead focused on, for example, the need to preserve memories of their group's victimization, to strengthen their group materially, for example, through reparations, and donating to people in need, but also symbolically through strengthening identity and culture as a consequence of what was lost through the group's victimization. Some also really focused on the in-group strength and power, on the need for justice and reparations, but on a more kind of structural level, as opposed to seeing it as an intergroup conflict. In some cases, people rejected a sense of victimhood and wanted to instead focus on the present and on the needs to strengthen, again, the in-group through material support. And there was also another factor here at the bottom, which Kurdish and Black American participants held, where there was a stronger focus on justice and redress, while also rejecting negative intergroup attitudes and instead focusing on political and structural solutions, not on how we think about or relate to the perpetrator group. So in sum, in conclusion, I hope these findings convince you that collective memories of in-group victimization do not inevitably result in cycles of violence. Of course, they can contribute to them, but it depends on how people and groups construe the group's victimization. And there are many different ways of construing the group's victimization that go beyond competitive victimhood. There are some collective victim beliefs, such as inclusive victim beliefs, that are also associated with solidarity, reconciliation, and other types of peace or related attitudes. But there are also a number of collective victim beliefs that don't focus at all on the former perpetrator group or other groups, and instead focus on the community, the in-group, in ways that do not have anything to do with intergroup conflict or hostility, but instead are simply focused on rebuilding and strengthening the community, on the group's resistance and resilience in light of ongoing oppression, and then work towards structural change and justice. So all of these are outcomes that do not harm other groups and do not actively contribute to intergroup conflict, but are aimed at more just societies. And a final point is simply that in all of this work, we need to, of course, pay more attention to the context differences instead of generalizing that collective victimhood will do this, but which context are we talking about, with what kind of history, what kind of current group position and politics, and also keeping in mind that there's a good degree of heterogeneity of views within each community instead of one dominant master narrative. Thank you.